This is Edward October, host of OctoberPod on YouTube. Hear that jingle jingle? It could be Kris Kringle, or a home invader looking for an open window, a jilted lover looking for revenge, or a disgruntled coworker hoping to spike your eggnog with arsenic. The girls of our true crime podcast are always on Santa's nice list, but the crimes they discuss are very naughty indeed. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey, Jen.
Hey, Cam, how are you?
I need a new song.
You do. Lovely. It's day 6 today.
It is day 6.
And as you know, and we will remind you, these episodes are shorter than normal. And since we do 12 real quick, they're not as heavily researched as we normally do. And also, they might be more common cases. Mm-hmm. Because
just a little appetizer for you.
Yeah, it's just a little holiday bonus to let you know that
to get you through the holiday season.
To let you know that we love you and we're there for you, buddies.
We're there, man.
We're there. But anyway, we hope your holiday season is going well. And are you ready for this one?
I'm so ready.
All right. Seated in the Cumberland County Civic Center in Fayetteville, North Carolina, 56-year-old farmer Rowland Stuart Taylor and his girlfriend, 45-year-old Velma Barfield, waited for the revival meeting to start. Although Stuart wasn't extremely religious, he knew that Velma, a devout Christian woman, would enjoy attending the revival hosted by famous televangelist Rex Humbird. In the late 1970s, it wasn't as common for couples of their generation to live together without being married. But Velma agreed to move in with him anyway. She wanted to get married, but parts of Velma's personality and criminal history sent up red flags for Stuart, so he put off any marriage plans for the time being.
Could be a smart move there, buddy.
Very smart. The revival was just getting started when Stuart felt a wave of nausea and abdominal discomfort. Thinking it was just something he ate, Stuart fidgeted but wanted to stay for the revival. As the service went on, he began to feel worse and worse. He didn't want to get sick at the Civic Center, but he also didn't want to disappoint Velma by leaving, so he decided to go out to his truck and lie down for a bit. It was cold and cloudy that February morning, but Stuart, in such pain and discomfort, welcomed that slap of brisk air to his face. The pain and nausea got worse as he laid down in the truck. And finally, when the revival ended, Velma returned to the truck and drove them home. She had to stop the vehicle at least once for Stuart to throw up on the side of the road. Stuart and Velma both assumed that he had one of the many strains of influenza, and he threw up all night long. He was clammy and sweaty and in such distress that he couldn't sleep. Velma called Stuart's friend, Sonny, to come over, and Stuart asked him to come care for his pigs, quote, just until I get over this flu. And Sonny, being a good friend, agreed. However, Stuart's condition worsened throughout the next day. He felt as though his insides were in fire, and he vomited nonstop. Unable to drive himself due to weakness, vomiting, and pain, Velma drove Stuart to the hospital, where the doctors told Stuart's family that he had gastritis. The ER doctor prescribed him some medicine and sent him home. And while Stuart's condition would improve the next day, it would only be a temporary reprieve. The day after that, while still vomiting, he was also experiencing diarrhea. And unable to get out of bed, he soiled the sheets where he lay. He writhed in pain and screamed out in agony. This time, an ambulance drove Stuart to the hospital, where he died within an hour of arriving. The doctor was uncomfortable with the situation surrounding Stuart's sudden demise and suggested to the family to have an autopsy performed, which Velma encouraged them to do. Throughout the funeral, Velma sat with Stuart's children, friends, and family, comforting them as best she could. Velma's son had come to the funeral to comfort his mother, She rode in the car with the immediate family and sat next to them in the pews during the service. Velma and her son were treated like one of the family. But on the day of the funeral, Lumberton Police Detective Benson Phillips received an anonymous phone call from a woman in South Carolina informing him that she thought Stuart had not died of natural causes and that, in fact, he had been murdered by his sweet, unassuming girlfriend, Velma Barfield. She had no proof, of course, but the caller felt certain that not only had Stuart been murdered, but he was not Velma's first victim. The caller even went so far as to claim that Velma had murdered her own mother. Detective Phillips pressed her for details and dates. Finally, when it seemed as though he could do nothing because it was all conjecture, the caller identified herself as Velma Barfield's sister. If Velma's own sister suspected her of her murder, the detective figured that he should do some investigating. Margie Velma Bullard was born on the 29th of October in 1938 in Eastover, North Carolina, but lived most of her childhood in Fayetteville. She was the second child and oldest daughter of Murphy and Lilia Bullard, and always went by the middle name of Velma. Like many children born during the Depression, her earliest years were spent trying to survive. The family of 7 children, some sources will say 9, and 2 adults was extremely poor. They had no electricity, no running water, and no outhouse, which meant the family had to use chamber pots and dump the wastes in the woods.
Eesh.
According to Velma, her father was not only abusive, but had raped her when she was 13. Most of the Bullard family deny the sexual abuse allegations. During this time, Velma grew up resenting her mother for not intervening on her children's behalf. It angered her that her mother was, in her eyes at least, weak, cowering, and submissive. Each time Velma got beaten, she shifted the blame to her mother. And if her father was as abusive as Velma claimed, she never seemed to consider that her mother was also receiving the abuse and had to deal with Murphy Bullard's constant infidelity. He was outrageously jealous and a hard drinker. If Lillian left him, how would she feed and clothe their children, and where would she go? For Lillian, it seemed it would be a no-win situation, a vicious circle of nightmares. And school was a double-edged sword for Velma. On one hand, when she was at school, she didn't have to deal with her mother, and she was out of her father's reach. It also allowed her time without the pressures of her family. However, she was also poor, and poor kids get made fun of at school. Early on, we see Velma disregarding the law and taking matters into her own hands to get what she wanted. She stole $80 from an elderly neighbor, and when her father found out, he beat her within an inch of her life. And $80 back then was a huge amount. Yeah. And while there are things from her childhood that she enjoyed, like playing baseball and swimming, for the most part, Velma felt like the only reason her parents wanted her around was for the unpaid labor she had provided them. She once described it as being, quote, a slave. It would be irresponsible not to point out that her siblings gave an account of their similar but different childhoods. Yes, they agreed that they were poor. Yes, they agreed that their father didn't spare the rod. And yes, Velma worked hard. But so did they. They quickly pointed out that most of the kids at that time did. In 1949, at 17 years old, Velma married Thomas Burke to escape her home life. The couple had 2 children, a boy born in 1951 and a girl born in 1953, and even if life wasn't perfect, Velma thought it was better than living with her parents. By all accounts, she was a good mother who loved her children and devoted a lot of her attention and energy to them. She always volunteered for field trips and helped with class projects, but trouble brewed on the horizon. After 14 years of marriage, Velma had to have a hysterectomy. The surgery profoundly affected her, leaving her in physical pain and mentally depressed. Her pain increased, and she became more dependent on prescription drugs as time passed. She was more hateful and resentful, and Thomas tried to avoid the confrontations and arguments with Velma by going out with his friends and drinking. Velma, she thought alcohol was pure evil. She argued with Thomas daily over his drinking. She would pour his booze down the sink when he wasn't looking. All the while, her dependency on prescription drugs flowered into a full-blown addiction. And Velma was not without grounds for concern. Thomas had been arrested for drunk driving in 1967, losing his license. So that means he drank more, which means she nagged more, and around they went. One day in 1969, while the kids were at school, Velma went to the laundromat to wash the family's laundry. When she returned, she found her house on fire.
Oh.
Her husband Thomas had died of smoke inhalation, along with 2 family pets, a cat and a dog. Velma and her children had lost everything in that fire. On August 23, 1970, Velma remarried a man by the name of Jennings Barfield. That's a Southern name, isn't it?
Isn't
Jennings?
it? Uh-huh. Woo!
Jennings was 16 years older than Velma and had taken early retirement due to numerous health issues like diabetes, emphysema, and heart disease. Velma was excited to finally get a church wedding, since she missed out on that with Thomas. However, Velma's prescription drug use strained the relationship from the beginning. She had accidentally overdosed twice in the 6 months following their wedding. The couple seemed to be headed to divorce, but it never really happened because Jennings Barfield died in March of 1971, just 7 months after that church wedding. The doctor said it was due to Jennings' history of heart disease, and the cause of death was officially heart failure. Velma Barfield's prescription drug use was out of control. She doctor hopped, getting 2 or 3 prescriptions from multiple doctors, none of them realizing what was happening, and none of the doctors ordered counseling of any kind. Velma's life was spiraling no matter how much she prayed and took her medications. Her son announced she was getting married, and Velma was horribly jealous. She'd always been the most important woman in his life, and she didn't want to be usurped. Velma moved in with her mother, Lillian, when her father passed away, and they argued daily. Then in 1974, Lillian, Velma's mother, became ill. She displayed symptoms of vomiting, diarrhea, and nausea. And after a trip to the hospital, she stayed like 3 or 4 days. Lillian got better. At this time, Velma also received an unexpected windfall of cash. A man she had been dating died in a car accident, and he, for some reason, made her beneficiary.
They were dating?
Just a man she knew.
No. Okay. I see you, Velma. I see you.
And he, for some reason, made her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. And she received a check for $5,000, which is about $31,000 today. Christmas rolled around, and Velma's mother pulled her son aside at a family holiday dinner and told him that she'd received a letter from a finance company. The letter stated that she was behind on her car loan and that her car would be repossessed if she didn't get the payments up to date. Funny thing was, she didn't have a car payment. The only vehicle that Lillian owned was paid for. So her son, Velma's brother, assured Lillian that it was probably just a clerical error and that he'd investigate that later. 6 days after that, Lillian Bullard died after a brief but violent illness in which Lillian said she felt like her insides, quote, were on fire. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack. In 1976, Velma began working and living with an elderly couple named Montgomery and Dolly Edwards. Montgomery Edwards was bedridden, and at 94 years old, he was nearly blind and had both legs amputated due to diabetes. He couldn't feed himself either. Montgomery's wife, Dolly, was 84 and a cancer survivor with a colostomy, but overall, she was in a little better condition than her husband. It wasn't long before Velma and Dolly were at odds. Dolly felt that Velma was lazy and didn't perform her job very well, and Velma complained that Dolly was just too picky. Much like the relationship she had with her mother, it was the older woman's unrealistic demands that were the problem. The problem was never Velma. Montgomery Edwards died in January of 1977, and Velma continued to live with Dolly and work for her. Only the following month, Dolly succumbed to a flu-like illness in which she suffered horrible vomiting and diarrhea. Since her employees were now dead, Velma quickly found another elderly couple to work for. John Henry Lee and his wife, Record, hired Velma because Record had broken her leg. Now, I'm going to stop this. It's spelled like record. I've only heard it pronounced once.
You can go either way.
Right. I've only heard it pronounced once, and it was Record. So that's what I'm going to go with. The Lee family agreed to let Velma have Sundays and Wednesdays off to attend church services. They couldn't believe how lucky they were to have such a kind, hardworking Christian woman in their home.
Mm-hmm.
There was only one weird incident while they were in Velma's care. A $50 check had been cashed at their bank by Record, only she had no memory of writing the check, and it wasn't her signature. And even though the police were called and a report was made, the forged check case soon stalled since nobody in the Lee family could think of a single person who would have had access to their checkbook or had any reason to steal from them. One can assume that nobody consulted their caregiver's police record, or they would have found Velma's stint in prison for check fraud. Now, Velma Barfield's life was one tragedy after another. On April 27, 1977, John Henry Lee became very sick. He went to the ER and was sent home after a few days. The doctors weren't sure what the cause of his illness was, but assumed it was a stomach virus of some sort. But soon John Henry Lee became sick again and was sick throughout most of May. His daughters often commented that they were so happy that he had such a wonderful caretaker during this trying time. John Henry Lee died on June 4th, 1977. Even though Record had become sickly and frail under the care of Velma, Velma decided to quit her job before Record could succumb to an identical illness like so many of the other people under Velma's care. Record, unknowingly, had survived the clutches of a serial poisoner. Now, it was at this time that Velma moved in with Stuart Taylor. Velma had met him through her employment with the Edwards family because Stuart was the nephew of Dolly Edwards, and Velma was smitten with Stuart.
Mm-hmm.
Shortly after she moved in with Stuart, he became sick at the revival meeting at the Civic Center and died. Even though Velma was adamant Stuart's family should have an autopsy done, she secretly hoped that the rat poison she'd given him would be missed on any test performed on his remains. But we all know that arsenic stays with you in your hair and your nails. And this is where Velma's luck ran out. The autopsy revealed Stuart had been poisoned with arsenic, and all of the evidence pointed to her. Realizing that she would most likely be found guilty of murdering Stuart, she decided to take the only defense that could save her life. She claimed that she wasn't trying to kill Stuart. She only wanted to make him sick so she could return the money that she had stolen from his account. In March of 1978, Velma was charged with first-degree murder. She then confessed to poisoning her mother, Lillian Bullard, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee, and she was also found guilty in court for murdering Stuart Taylor. However, later she admitted to her son that she started the fire that killed her first husband, Thomas Burke, who was the father of her children. When her second husband's remains were exhumed and the same rat poisoning was found in his body, Velma never admitted to poisoning him. Now, Velma's children were in shock. Their mother had just admitted to giving her boyfriend arsenic. Regardless of the intent, the fact that their beloved mother could do that was earth-shaking. Still, if she was only trying to make Stuart sick and he died because of that, it would be a second-degree murder case, not a case of first degree. And since North Carolina is a death penalty state, the difference between first-degree and second-degree murder meant Velma's life. To prove that Velma's intention had been murdered, the prosecuting attorney, Joe Freeman Britt, a cigar-smoking, unshakable advocate of capital punishment, wanted to introduce the evidence of poisoning in all the other unexpected deaths surrounding Velma. After killing so many people, Britt argued that Velma knew the poison wouldn't make Stuart sick. She knew that he would eventually die from it, proving that she intended to kill, which would thereby make it first-degree murder case, not second. Her defense lawyer argued that she wasn't on trial for any of those other cases and that it would prejudice the jury. The judge ruled in favor of the prosecution and allowed the evidence from the other murders to be used. During the trial, Velma would argue that she didn't believe the poison that she administered to her victims killed them because it wasn't found in their autopsies immediately. At one point, Joe Britt asked her, quote, "You made Mrs. Edwards sick with Singletary's rat poisoning, did you not?" And Velma responded with, quote, "No, I thought it was roach and ant poison." To say that Velma disliked the prosecuting attorney is pretty evident. When he finished his closing arguments, Velma made a gesture of silent applause to him. Very petty. Ultimately, Velma tried to convince the jury that she didn't know the poison could kill her victims. Maybe that argument could be made for the first one, but every one after that, she had to see that not only would they die, but they would die violent and painful deaths. Arsenic eats you from the inside out. That's basically, it's bad.
I was going to say, but I was saving it for the end, that I think this would have to be one of the worst ways to go.
Oh, she's a horrible person. The jury found Velma guilty and sentenced her to death. And interesting to note from Wikipedia, so quote, in 1967, all executions had been suspended by the federal courts in the U.S. until constitutional issues relating to capital punishment could be resolved. By 1976, most states had revised their statutes to conform to Supreme Court guidelines, and capital punishment was reinstated. Just 2 years before she's caught, the death penalty was put back on the books. The defense had hammered home how Velma's drug addiction would have badly impaired her judgment, and therefore she could not realize the consequences of her actions.
Yes,
and the other side, I know, thank you.
Please.
The other side argued that she never sought any treatment for her psychological issues or drug addictions and could have done that at any time. Furthermore, Velma functioned in society and was considered a kind and caring woman. She could go to church and she appeared normal. So how impaired could she have been? And just to let you know how bad her addiction was, this is a quote from the book Death Sentence by Jerry Bledsoe, who also wrote Bitter Blood from episode 250 or something like that, 230. Mm-hmm. Quote, "In the 9 years between Thomas's death, which is her first husband, and until her arrest, Velma would get prescriptions from more than 24 doctors, not only for Valium, but for nearly 24 other drugs, most of them addictive, including barbiturates, narcotics, sleeping pills, stimulants, and antidepressants. All of them prescribed by doctors trying to be helpful."
How did she not OD on her own?
I don't know. How could you function? Because, I mean, if she's taking Valium and then she takes lithium or any kind of sleeping pill, you know what I mean? I mean, how did she even stand?
Yeah.
Those who defended Velma point out that the murders were all about her survival. She had to steal money to get more drugs to support her habit, and then kill those she stole from to cover up the theft. However, at least 2 of her victims don't subscribe to that motive. Furthermore, there seems to be a cognitive dissonance in Barfield's case. She felt that she had the right to condemn her first husband for his alcoholism while in the throes of a turbulent drug addiction herself. She complained of being nothing more than a servant to her parents, and yet, when her first husband had worn out his usefulness, she killed him. Basically, they were useless to her if she couldn't get something from them. She also seemed oblivious to the irony of serving her boyfriend a cup of poison just before leaving the house to attend an evangelical church service. A death penalty sentence is automatically appealed, and that was true for Velma. While in jail, Velma became a born-again Christian, even though she had claimed to be a Christian throughout her whole life. But while in jail, she set about administering the Word of God to other cellmates. Even the famous Billy Graham and his wife, who were so moved by her piety, they took up her cause. Velma Barfield would file numerous appeals, and they all were shot down for one reason or another. At one appeal, her lawyers used the testimony of Dorothy Lewis, a professor of psychiatry at NYU School of Medicine. Now, she claimed that Barfield suffered from dissociative identity disorder and that Velma Barfield's, quote, other personality, Billy, had committed the murders. The judge was quoted as saying, "One of them did it. I don't care which one."
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Later, the governor refused Velma's request for clemency, stating that her victims had, quote, literally been tortured to death. And so Velma finally instructed her attorneys to abandon any further appeals, and her execution was slated for November 2nd, 1984, at Central Prison. The statement she released before her execution was, quote, I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I'm sorry, and I want to thank everybody who have been supportive of me all these 6 years. Velma, unable to face a last meal, asked one of the guards to get her a bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. She got permission to wear pajamas to the execution. So when the day came, they put her in a diaper, and she donned on a robe and went to the death chamber, which Billy Graham's daughter had told her to think of it as, quote, the gateway to heaven. At 2:15 a.m., Velma Barfield was pronounced dead. Velma Barfield was the first woman executed in the United States since they reinstated the death penalty 2 years prior. As is typical in a story involving capital punishment, there is always a loud noise from the issue afterward. One side says that it's inhumane to execute another human being and that it's equivalent to state-sanctioned murder. And the other side is quick to point out the hideousness of the premeditated murder of innocent people. It's the whole eye for an eye and so on. And this was no different in the case of Velma Barfield. There were demonstrations before her execution, and like one side, there would have like signs that said, bye-bye, Velma, and then there were other people that said, you know what, poor thing had a hard life, and she was a woman. That was a big problem, that they were going to execute a woman. And then to top it on off, they were going to execute an elderly woman, which I feel is very hurtful because Velma was only 53. And that whole
That's elderly?
Thank you. Yes, no. Elderly. Yeah, that was a big F you. So, I have a problem with them using the word elderly. But yeah, she was only 53 when she was executed. And if you look at her, she looks older. But that was the time.
That was the time. Yeah, they always did that.
What's not argued is the tragedy of it all. Velma's own life was one of poverty, disappointment, and addiction. And seemingly, she felt that she had the right to inflict the suffering she resented in her own life, and she took the life of those who trusted her. She took them in the most horrible, coldest way possible.
Yeah, I think that would honestly, like I said earlier, one of the you are dying from the inside out. That would be
you're
brutal.
Being eaten away. Like I can't even imagine feeding that to the actual rats or any living creature. It's horrible. It's a horrible way to die.
Horrible way to go.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's Velma Barfield. Horrible woman. And like I said, Jerry Bledsoe, who wrote the book Bitter Blood, which I think was the cousin killings with, I can't think of the name now, Susie Lynch Newsom. Susie Newsom Lynch. Fritz Klenner. He wrote that book. And he also wrote a book called Death Sentence, which is all about Velma.
Yeah, I can see the cover of Bitter Blood. It's a black thing with red lettering.
Right.
Yep.
But you can still, I'll put the link to the book if you want to go delve in more about Velma. She's something. I mean, she's cold and meticulous and...
and that's like, not to be crude here, but that is a long, slow, painful death. And you're seeing it. So it's like, I wonder if she had some sort of, how do I say that? You know what I'm saying? Like she enjoyed watching them suffer.
Well, because she suffered. So I think she felt that, I don't know. I don't know. I just know that she was cold and calculating and evil. I mean, to put it simple.
Oh, Velma.
In simple terms, she was evil. I mean, she watched these people.
And ideally, she loved part of them. I mean, I hope.
Well, she was smitten with Stuart. But yeah, she's evil. Pure and simple.
Well, good job, Jen.
Yeah, that's number 6.
Interesting.
We're halfway through. Anyway, that's number 6. We'll see you tomorrow with number 7. And I think that's you. That's on you, isn't it?
Back at me.
That's back at you.
Back at me. All right. Until tomorrow, day 7. Remember, lock your doors.
And don't drink anything Velma hands you.
Ooh, for sure. Ooh, stay away.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. All right. Love you.
Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Love ya. For more information about this episode, as well as all other sources, please check out our show notes or the podcast website at ourtruecrimepodcast.com. Our True Crime Podcast is developed and created by the hosts, Jen and Cam. Original music and audio mix of all our True Crime Podcast episodes is courtesy of Nico Vertese from We Talk of Dreams. You can reach Nico at wetalkofdreams.com. Listener discretion is provided by Edward October from OctoberPod VHS. You can find all of his great works on YouTube. Please make sure to like and subscribe to our True Crime Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We can be reached on Instagram and Facebook at Our True Crime Podcast or on Twitter with the handle at Our True Crime Pod. You can also email us at ourtruecrimepodcast@gmail.com. We would also at this time like to thank our patrons. We would be so lost without you. Thank you so much. And if you would like to help support the show, you can check us out on patreon.com/Our True Crime Podcast. You can also show your support by leaving a 5-star review on Apple or simply just tell your friends about us. It's that easy. Love ya.